people who don't like their weight. They don't like, well, I weigh this much, but that's not enough. You have got to decide and make a decision. Watch this. I call it a quality decision. Not a half-hearted decision, but a quality decision where you'd be willing to sign your name. A quality decision that says, I am going to change, okay? Not, watch this, I'm going to try to change. When I hear people say, I'm going to try to do something, it's like an honest lie. It's like you've already set yourself up for not doing something. But decision is the open door into reality. And the process of change starts with a decision. I want you to recognize something. The day you made a decision to become a born-again Christian, heaven backed you up. Notice there was nothing that the devil could do to stop that decision from going into motion. And ladies and gentlemen, when you make a decision to change, heaven will back you up. When you're changing from the worst to things that line up with the Word of God, heaven is ready to back you up. Number two, desire. Not only do you have to make a decision to change, you've got to have a strong desire to change. You know, you will never change because someone desires it for you. You know that, don't you? Oh, I really wish Johnny would change. You ain't going to change because somebody else desires it. You can't change based on somebody else's desire. You have got to have a strong desire to change. And we do things because listen, and this is so true. We do things because we ought to versus we want to. And that's a huge thing there. You know, we're always doing what I do it because I ought to do it instead of because I want to do it. Desire is the motivation of life, and what one desires will ultimately be the thing that drives them. It's based on your desire. You know, you take a husband and a wife, and then that husband says, you know what? I ought to be doing this as a husband, and I ought to be doing that as a wife, and I ought to be doing that as a husband. It won't be long before you recognize, I don't want to do this no more. Because me doing something because I ought to do it is just not going to be the motivation necessary to drive me to the thing that needs to be done. And so the question comes up, well, what do you do? What do you do when, you don't have that desire to do something? What if you've been caught in the rut of, I'm doing what I ought to do as a Christian? Well, I ought to come to church, and that's miserable. Well, I ought to read my Bible, and you fall asleep every time your first two lines, you know. Well, I ought to be nice, and well, I ought to walk in love. You know what happens? I mean, you're trying to use your willpower to do it because you ought to do it. And so we're not really seeing the strong motivational power of desire. And so the question is, how in the world do I get out of this thing? The way to change the spirit of your mind is to change the I ought to's to the I want to's. Is something that simple? Oh, absolutely. Please listen to me for a moment. In just how you say a thing begins to determine how you start thinking about a thing. If you just open your mouth up when you don't have a desire and just say something that's simple, I want to have a desire to lose weight. You're doing more to initiate desire to do something versus what you ought to. I want to have a desire to live a better life as a Christian. That's where you start. You start opening your mouth up and calling those things that be not as though they were. You start speaking those things into existence that may be absent in your heart and in your mind and in your thinking. I want to have a desire to be a better friend. I want to have a desire. When you do that, that's the first step. But you got to leave this little silent I ought to, only reason I'm doing this because that's what I'm supposed to do. Well, I'm just trying to live right, so that's why I'm doing that. No, you need to start talking yourself into the right attitude. And you start off by saying, you know what? I want to have a desire to be the best husband that I can be. And then don't finish that with, I don't, but I want to. Now, see, you canceling out everything. You're canceling out your confession of what you want to desire by going back and talking about, well, I ought to, but no. Just speak what's the Bible say? Call those things that what? Be not as though they were. He didn't say try to call away the thing that is. Don't call away the thing that is. I shared the testimony with you about when Red Lobster was open down here off Old National. I walked in, there's a dear sister had her arm in a sling. It was broke. And I came up to her and spoke to her and said, hey, how you doing? I said, oh, I apologize for your arm. She said, oh, it ain't broke. I said, now I know what she's trying to do, but she's missing it. I said, well, you're having it in a cast. She says, oh, but it ain't broke. And I said, yes, it is. I said, because if it wasn't broke, you wouldn't have it in no cast. Well, I knew what she was trying to do. She was